the aviation industry is really focused on SAF and thinking almost not at all about carbon removals. And yet it looks like they're probably going to have to be more or less at least equal contributors to the answer.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Joining us for today's episode is Dr. Gabrielle Walker, who is one of the leading voices on climate change and also the co-founder of CUR8, a platform focused on accelerating access to reliable carbon removal credits. Gabrielle, thank you so much for being able to join us today. It's an honor to have you on the show. Now, because carbon removal is still such a new space and the vast majority of folks in this area found themselves here through other industries, we're always very curious to know how our guests came to enter the carbon industry. Let's call it. So if you don't mind, it would be great to hear about your background and experience that essentially brought you to this sector.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. It's a real pleasure to be on the show. Thanks, Violet. So I've been working on climate change for 30 years. I started back in the 90s and have worked on more or less every aspect, different sectors, different parts of different solutions. I've worked in media, science, politics. I've worked in among non-profits and among for-profits and across every business sector. And so the way I arrived at carbon removals was actually, in the end, quite intentional, because there was a point at about 5 or 6 years ago when, having worked in lots of different parts of the climate space, I started asking myself, where can I have the biggest impact? And I actually spent a year of quite intentional due diligence. I give a lot of keynotes. And so as I was going around the place giving keynotes, I was talking to different people, understanding different points of view and thinking, where can I have the biggest impact? And what I was looking for was an area of climate change where it needed to be a very substantial part of the answer, but was not getting a commensurate part of the attention. And that's where this whole area of negative emissions, carbon removals, the net part of net zero comes in, where I realized that all of the science, and I'm a scientist by training, my PhD's in chemistry, all of the science was saying we're going to need very, very large amounts of negative emissions to the tune of billions of tons of carbon removals to have any chance whatsoever of meeting our climate goals. It's way too late to do it without that, and it has been for some time. And yet when I looked at the people and the attention and the money and the focus that was happening in this area of making negative emissions carbon removals, it was almost nothing. This was back in 2019. So I started thinking, well, I should do something about that and see whether I can help find other people who want to do the same. So in around 2019, 2020, I started doing more work in this area, gathering together teams, finding out other people who are interested, started working with the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the United Nations body that does the political negotiations. And they have this group called the Climate Champions, which corrals all the non-state actors, everyone who aren't the negotiators who are working on climate. So we got together and we started a project which became an organization called Rethinking Removals, as an attempt to understand why this wasn't getting more attention, why people weren't really working on it more intensely. And as part of that, I did a TED talk on carbon removals, and we made a big song and dance about it, and we took a dog and pony show around the place, and we asked people what the issues are, where the fault lines are, what's stopping you from acting. And as a consequence of all that, I actually turned Rethinking Removals into a non-profit organization, which is which is running now, to try to help unblock some of the blockers that we're encountering and really connect people in the space. But then what I also discovered was that as I was still giving the keynotes, but now talking about carbon removals, people were constantly saying, businesses were saying, so what do we do? How do we start? And I would say, well, you need to find projects, you need to do due diligence on them, you need to put together a sensible portfolio of different durabilities and different approaches. And then you also need to make sure that this is compliant with the burgeoning claims, codes that are coming out of the voluntary rules, and that it's on the right pathway to compliance. It needs to fit with your net zero plan. And they'd stare at me in horror, like, I don't even know where to start. And so then I thought, someone needs to answer this. I need a better answer. And therefore I need to found a company that can provide this solution. And in that process, I really know a lot about climate change. And by this point, I really knew a lot about carbon removals, but I don't really know very much about founding a company, or at least I didn't. And that was the point where I had the immense good fortune to bump into the very brilliant Marta Kropinska is one of my co-founders at CUR8, who had decided she wanted to found a company to answer the same problem. She didn't know about climate, she didn't know about carbon removals, but she's a brilliant serial entrepreneur, and she really knows how to make companies. And so together, we set up CUR8, not just to be a kind of platform, but to be a market maker, to identify everything that's needed to get carbon removals to scale and then to provide it.
Excellent. Your journey is really a fascinating one. Could you dive more into what exactly CUR8 does and how it helps raise awareness about carbon removals and how it helps buyers build a better understanding about it?
Sure, I'm happy to. So Rethinking Removals and CUR8 are sister organizations. We actually, there's a non-profit and for-profit. The way I describe it is that Rethinking Removals helps keep CUR8 honest and focused on the mission that we have to scale carbon removals at the pace that's needed according to the science. So Rethinking Removals helps keep CUR8 honest, and CUR8 helps keep Rethinking Removals real, because through CUR8, we really understand what it's like to try to do this in practice. And so it means that it gets away from the dangers of just kind of being very theoretical and saying in a perfect world, this should be true without looking at what works on the ground. So having said that, CUR8, as a market maker, we started off as brokers. So finding projects, doing immensely detailed due diligence on them, because in the absence of widely accepted standards or methodologies or protocols, it's really important to make sure that the projects are as bulletproof as they can be. And then also working with the suppliers for how they can, what they actually need to be able to scale more quickly. So that whole piece of work on the science and the supply. And then we also worked with buyers who have a net zero plan, who understand that in addition to reducing, they're going to need to remove and want to understand how they can start to play in this space, and all the way from some buyers who wanted to engage by removing the emissions from an event. So our first client was the Queen. We actually removed the emissions from the Queen's Jubilee pageant in the UK. And then we removed the London Marathon. We did the world's first carbon removed concerts at the massive O2 venue here in London. So removing events all the way through to companies that have a plan for their reductions, now want a plan for their removals, of building long-term offtake agreements with very big players and very big buys. And so, it's that and everywhere in between. And we're finding that more and more companies want to start engaging. There's plenty of on-ramps for this journey, and we're helping them to make those on-ramps. We're helping them to tell the stories, helping them to understand and navigate the very complicated claims landscape at the moment between the voluntary and the oncoming compliance. So that's what we were doing in brokering, and we're doing that very much still now. But that was also an opportunity to learn the market and to understand what's needed. And so we started building software. We've built software to automate the due diligence, to make it easier to interrogate and to understand the different evolving nature of the risks that are involved. We have software for tracking once you've bought your portfolio, for tracking it, for seeing when the credits need to be retired and how you can handle that. We're building software for tracking offtakes. It becomes very complicated. A lot of this area, like many others before them, is going to be developed by companies making advanced purchase commitments. But if you sort of promise to buy in the future, but you have something that's bankable for now, how do you handle that? And how do you actually track when the credits become available, when the money changes hands, when you retire, and so on? And then so that's a whole bunch of software. Then on top of that, we've also started looking at carbon financing. And so we made a first of a kind instrument for, in a sense, monetizing offtakes up front. So the way that I describe this is basically the intention is to get the money in the hands of the people with the shovels on the ground who are trying to make the carbon removals happen. So for them, it's really important if they get an offtake from a very reputable company that is going to, follow through on its contracts, they can prove there's going to be a future market. At the moment, carbon removals are so small and so new that nobody knows if there's going to be a market. Is anyone going to want it? Is there going to be a demand? You can put all this money into building it, but they might not come. And so if you have an offtake, you can say, look, they're going to come. And then the question is, how does that get money in your hands? And everybody was sort of saying, well, if you've got an offtake, you'd be able to get the money, you'd be able to get the financing. So we decided to check, well, is that true? Can it be done? And it actually nearly killed many of us. It took 6 months to go through all the details, but we made a financing instrument. So the offtake came from British Airways. The debt financing came from Standard Chartered. We had a very reputable and good supplier of, in this case, enhanced rock weathering removals called Undo, and we put the whole deal together. And so now we're looking to see how we scale that. So this means that buyers don't have to put the money up front, but do have to make a firm commitment. And then providers of capital can then work through this instrument to understand how the risk gets allocated and can provide that capital. And then the people on the ground with the shovels get the money and they can scale at the pace that they need.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all that. That is really fascinating. I'd like to get into the partnership with Undo and British Airways and Standard Chartered, if possible. Specifically, since it involves a major airline, I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit as to the dichotomy of carbon removal versus sustainable aviation fuel. Yeah, how do these solutions compare to one another in terms of effectiveness and also in terms of cost?
It's an interesting question because, in a way, I've been digging into this quite a lot, and I spoke at I've spoken at 3 actively aviation events this year, and I've begun to understand how much many of the aviation industry are kind of depending on and leaning on sustainable aviation fuel, and I kind of understand why. Apart from anything else, it's really tempting to do that. Everybody's always constantly in the climate space looking for silver bullets. And sustainable aviation fuel is a drop-in fuel. It feels like it's a kind of the silver bullet answer to the question of how to handle aviation. But then others are saying sort of sustainable aviation fuel versus carbon removals. I think we need to get a bit away from which is better. There are circumstances in which it makes sense to do more SAF or less SAF, or more removals or less removals. But the most important thing for me is, how do they work together as part of the overall climate solution? Because one of the things that I noticed is that the aviation industry is really focused on SAF and thinking almost not at all about carbon removals. And yet it looks like they're probably going to have to be more or less at least equal contributors to the answer. I was in one of the aviation events, Sustainable Skies in Farnborough earlier this year, and the chief sustainability officer of Boeing showed me a model that Boeing had put together, and they've had input from lots of great academic institutions, Harvard, Cambridge, and to work on building this model. And what they do is they have different inputs. Electric flights, improved efficiency of operations, like how long the plane is taxiing, or how long the plane is stacking before it lands, all that sort of stuff. And then also improved engines, improved efficiency of the planes when they're in the sky, sustainable aviation fuel, and also kind of the thing that fills in the missing part, which is carbon removals. And, depending on what assumptions you put in about how much renewable electricity is going to be available, how much efficiency you can achieve, how much the SAF's going to cost, what the availability is of biomass to be able to create the SAF, or CO2 taken from the air to be able to create the SAF. If you put in just reasonable assumptions for everything, the answer becomes that more than 50% of the solution has to be a combination of SAF and removals. And it's probably something like 50-50 of that. So removals are going to be 25 or 30% of the solution. And that's, by the way, what the CEO of British Airways said at Farnborough as well. So given that removals are going to have to be 25-30% of the solution, and they're currently getting for the 1% of the attention, I think that's one of the ways in which I'd say the balance needs to shift. But then there's also the question of how much they cost, how scalable they are. We just saw that Air New Zealand made this very dramatic commitment to It's this climate goal where it was going to lower its emissions by 29% by 2030, and now it's just pulled back from it completely. And it said that the reason is that it's just been so hard to get enough sustainable aviation fuel at the price that's needed. It's just availability and price. And so you see that, and I see that, and I think we need to continue trying to scale sustainable aviation fuel. We need to continue with those efforts, but we also need to bring carbon removals properly into that mix.
So would you say largely, like, having, participated in these different events in the aviation industry, would you say that by and large, like, people see the need for carbon removal, or is it still, like, far from being recognized?
I think it's starting to be there. So there are some big players of the aviation industry. Of course, British Airways is all over this, as demonstrated by the work that we're doing with them, and Airbus has been made one of the first big purchases of carbon removals a couple of years ago, and Boeing's looking into this, and other airlines are looking into this to some extent. But I don't think it's getting it's definitely not getting the same level of concerted attention. And if it takes sort of 10 years for carbon removals to be in the place where SAF is now, then that will be too late. So I think the aviation industry really needs to up the ante on this, and to take the lessons learned from SAF and really start to apply them quickly to scaling carbon removals. Part of the SAF would certainly, it's never going to be all of the answer, but it would now be more available and more cheap if the aviation industry had taken it more seriously, more quickly. And that's a lesson I think we need to apply to removals.
Excellent. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which, aviation aside, what is the best, most sensible way to put together carbon removal portfolios? Like, is there a worked out formula that tells you the best proportions of different CDR solutions out there?
If only there were, and everybody agreed on it, wouldn't that be nice? I think that there are still plenty of people out there that say to me, the first question I always get is, do you mean nature or tech when I talk about carbon removals? As if there's a binary between the two. And the second question I get is, which one's the best? And the portfolio approach is what I always come back with, because it's not as simple as nature versus tech. There's an entire spectrum of carbon removals approaches. Some of them are a bit more on the nature side. Some of them are a bit more technical. Many of them are in between. And I think many of the removals approaches that are going to bring us a bigger scale come in that kind of hybrid middle ground. And so it's just not really helpful to think about it as just being one or the other. And then it's also not really helpful to say which is the best, because they've all got things that are brilliant about them. They've all got challenges. And it's only when you put them together that you can spread the costs. So some of them are extremely expensive, and you need to have the less expensive ones to kind of spread out the cost and make it tractable to start now. You also need to spread out the risk of which ones are actually going to be the ones that will scale at the pace that we need to, and which ones are going to fall away, and which ones might not be delivered in the way that we think, so others are going to have to swap in. And you also have to spread the durability. So people get very excited about saying removals need to be permanent. I think that we've got this notion that permanence equals good quality. And that's kind of come from the old voluntary carbon market offset space, the avoidance credits, not carbon removals, but the ones that were sort of trading it. I won't emit, and you can pay me not to emit, so that you can then take some kind of claim from it. And in that case, you had to be able to show that if the carbon wasn't emitted, it was never emitted. And so the concept of permanence became very, very, very appreciated and approved of. But in the carbon removal space, I think it's much more powerful to talk about durabilities and bands of durabilities, because there are some carbon removals where you take it out of the sky and it stays out for decades, others for centuries, others for millennia. And we sort of need balances of all of those things. Ideally, we just do all of our carbon removal. We just suck all the CO2 out of the sky that we put in, and we permanently lock it away for thousands of years, and that will be fine. But it's a long time before we're going to get to anything like the scale that we need at that level of durability. And in the meantime, we need to be removing both to build the industry and to understand how to do it, and also to be taking the CO2 out of the sky now, because every CO2 ton that we can take out now helps stop us get closer to some of those most dangerous tipping points while we're building the rest of the industry. So when here at CUR8, we put together portfolios that include some approaches that are relatively lower durability of the tens to hundreds of years. We don't go below 40 years. That's what the core carbon principles have stated for good carbon credits. But most of our credits are more than 100 years. But we then have others in a band of 1,000 years and others in the band of 10,000 years. And we focus on removals that have a path to scalability. So we do the due diligence to make sure that they do what they say they're going to do. We also look at these bands of durabilities, but we're looking at, does this have a route to scale? Because we want to be supporting the approaches that really do have that route to scale. So we're supporting the growth of the industry. And we also, of course, look at things like, are they likely to stay in business? Is this an approach that is financeable? Is it additional? Would it have happened anyway, so it doesn't need our help? Those kinds of considerations as well. And when you put all that together, you find that you need to balance all of those things. You need to balance the costs, the risks, and the durabilities, as well as balancing which approaches you have in there that have the route to scale, both to make something that's future-proof and also to make something that's genuinely market-making and genuinely growing the industry.
Gabrielle, inevitably I have to ask, what do you see the future of CDR looking like in that case? Do you see this market kind of exploding like some experts out there predict, or?
If we do our job right, if we don't do our job right, then the world is in serious trouble. The opinion is different as to how much carbon removals we're actually going to need, but even heroic assumptions, absolutely heroic assumptions, say that this is going to be 10% of the solution. I've seen scientific papers that have said that we're going to have 18% residual emissions by 2050, even if we do everything we possibly can. And I see every day headlines saying this is rowing back, this is turning out to be more difficult than we thought. It's going to be a very large part of the answer. And if it is going to be a very large part of the answer, that means that we're looking at 10 to 15 billion tons a year by 2050. And if you think that the likely average cost of those by the time we've got all the costs down the curve is going to be at least of the order of $100, then you can do the math and see this is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And I think that the more people notice that, the faster this will happen. And if I were a betting woman, I would say that brace yourself when the floodgates open. I don't think it's going to be in the next 6 months or 12 months, but the next 18 to 24, I think this is going to be a real big shift. I've seen plenty of analysis suggesting that we could be in the $1 trillion market ballpark by the mid 2030s. And I think that's probably not wrong.
In that line of thought, there's also much talk about government procurement right now, and the U.S. is particularly doubling down on policy support for carbon removal. So do you see that being the case in Europe anytime soon? Also, perhaps within that time frame that you mentioned, 18 to 24 months?
I think it's a bit of an interesting race who's leading more between the US and Europe on this, because, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives and then the beginnings of government procurement are kind of showing up. Although not vast amounts of procurement at the moment, it's much more in the line of tax credits in the US for the policy support. There's plenty of government procurement starting in Europe. In Sweden, for example, there's also the European Commission has come up with the carbon removal certification framework to start the process of certifying what carbon removal should be. The UK is just about to, in fact, 4 days ago, it closed the first consultation on incorporating carbon removals into the emissions trading scheme. And the EU is going to make a decision on that by 2026. And so I think that we're also, we're seeing different kinds of support. It does reflect the different kind of philosophies. In the US, it's more likely to be a tax credit. In the European Union, it's more likely to be a mandate or some kind of obligation. But I do think that ultimately, there's a lot of talk about the voluntary carbon market. And of course, that's where we're playing in CUR8 at the moment. But that's never going to be enough. At the moment, it's only $2 billion or so. And it's never going to be enough on its own. It's always a precursor to sort of show it can be done so that the compliance markets and the government procurement incentives can take over. And I think a lot of the scaling is probably going to be where, it's not about buying credits at all, but more like companies that can provide this as a service, companies that can do this as insetting. When you're designing a building or a town or a city or a road, or how can you incorporate carbon removals into that process, and what incentives are the government giving you to do that, and what will clients pay you to do that? And so I think that's probably where the biggest growth is going to be. But it does require this step of companies stepping up and buying what they need to start the whole thing off.
Gabrielle, for my final question, I was really curious to ask you about any upcoming announcements or developments that CUR8 has lined up.
Oh, I wish I could tell you. It's so enticing and juicy. We've got some really cool stuff coming up, but not quite allowed to yet. But I will just trail with this space is getting very exciting, and watch this space. There's going to be something cool to tell you soon.
I'm really looking forward to that. Gabrielle, thank you so much for your time and the incredibly valuable insights that you've shared with us today. It was a wonderful, wonderful pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you, Violet. I enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.